right, so welcome to episode 1 of Inkululeko's new conversation series on education of Africa. With Inkululeko's commitment to the transformative power of education for motivated students in Makanda, South Africa, we recognize that the challenges and opportunities of education across the continent are diverse. Our aim is to give voice to this diversity. I am Taylor Battle, Chair of Friends of Inkululeko, and alongside of me, I have Keith Davis, who is the co-chair of Friends of Inkululeko, and we will be sharing these voices with you. Keith, who are we speaking with today?
Thanks, Taylor. Today we're speaking with Khwima Mwasinga of the Africa Center for Strategic Progress. Khwima is a humanitarian worker for gender specialist with over 4 years work experience working for organizations such as UNWOMEN Malawi, Jesuit Refugee Service, and Voluntary Service Overseas. Khwima holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Malawi and a postgraduate diploma in international gender studies from the University of Iceland. Khwima currently works for the Africa Center for Strategic Progress as a research fellow for the Youth, Gender, and Vulnerability Policy Lab. Today, Khwima is speaking with us from Malawi. Welcome, Khwima.
Thank you, Keith. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Khwima. So Khwima, can you start us off by just briefly speaking about the work that you do at the Africa Center for Strategic Progress?
Well, I'm a research fellow. So basically, I conduct research for the Africa Center for Strategic Progress under the Youth, Gender, and Vulnerability Policy Lab, as Keith has mentioned. And basically, we try to, it's a think tank, an Africa-centered think tank, which basically tries to look into solutions to problems to African issues. So my main role is trying to analyze policies, write about, current events in African countries. I recently got my article published, and I was basically writing about the gendered impacts of COVID-19 in Malawi. So that was fun.
Khwima, can you tell us what, I know that you work a lot with the refugee point of view. What does refugee education look like for children in Southern Africa?
Well, I'm going to give you my perspective based on Malawi and a little bit of South Africa as well, because I worked in the Dzaleka refugee camp in Malawi. Well, refugees and asylum seekers in Malawi are confined to a refugee camp. So they're under their encampment policy, which doesn't allow them to integrate in the Malawian community. It doesn't allow them to work. It doesn't allow them a lot of things. So they're basically confined there. We have a lot of specialists, we have doctors there, we have lawyers, we have bright kids that have just finished their secondary school or even tertiary education, but they can't go anywhere because of the system here. And in South Africa, I know that it's a more liberal situation. Migrants basically are free to work, they're free to get an education, which is amazing, I feel like. But with the current statistics that only 3% of refugees around the world are able to access tertiary education, it's huge, because we're only looking at 3%, and there's over 70 million refugees around the world. So it's scary that only 3% of those can access tertiary education. So I think that's also the case in a lot of countries as well. If they allow refugees to access an education, they're faced with discrimination or the high costs of education in the respective countries.
Okay, so feeding off of that response, what would you say are some of the core challenges in the education system as it relates to the refugee population?
I think the most important one is policies. We don't have inclusive policies in most African countries, which is a problem, because we're looking at governments that are not willing to go that extra mile to try to put in laws and policies that protect refugees, or try to put in laws and policies that are inclusive for refugees. And I think the other problem would also be that the education system itself kind of, because as I mentioned, in South Africa, they have a more liberal approach to migrants and refugees, but in as much as they allow refugees to be able to integrate, to find jobs, to get an education, they're faced with discrimination when they go into these schools. So you have an education system that's also failing them, in addition to policies that are failing them as well. So we have, one problem after another, and I feel like refugees do not have the incentive to go that extra mile to try to get an education, because what's the point, right? After that, they're not going to be able to get a job, or if they go to school, they're not going to be given that extra attention because they're a refugee. They're going to be discriminated against. Or if they do want to get an education, they don't have the money to pay for that education. So it's just problem after problem after problem for a lot of refugee youth when in terms of accessing education.
So Khwima, what are the opportunities around chipping away at those numerous problems? I know that you indicated that policy was the path forward. What kind of policies specifically are the beginning sets of that, and how do we begin to get forward movement?
Well, first of all, it starts with governments. Like I mentioned, that we do need inclusive systems. So, for example, in Malawi, I'm an advocate for the getting rid of the camp, allowing refugees to integrate, because they have so much to give. So if our governments are willing to say that, okay, in as much as there might be problems with integrating refugees in communities, but for now, let's try to take that extra step to either let them integrate, or if they're going to be stuck in the camp, if they're eligible to get a job, they should get a job. If they're qualified to be doctors, they should be doctors. Why not? They have so much to give, and yet they're stuck in these camps and wasting their potential. So I think that's the most important thing. Advocate, try to get governments to allow these inclusive systems, because if they put up actual policies and laws, that's, goes a long way. It now comes down to trying to raise awareness, trying to educate people about how refugees have so much to give when they are integrated in communities and when they are allowed to go into these spaces.
That's a lot. So my question for you would be, for anyone who is either working in the area of refugee, where they're serving refugee population, and they wanted to take a particular action to address the issue, that all of the issues that you just named, like what would be, I guess maybe like one of the top one or two suggested actions that they could tangibly take in order to address this issue?
Well, the most important one is to advocate. Advocacy goes a long way. We've seen around the world how, for example, with the Black Lives Matter movement, how every single country in the world has united, not every single country, but most countries have united to advocate for the BLM movement, and it's brought about solid change. We even saw in South Africa when I've forgotten her name, I'm sorry, but a girl was murdered in a post office, and so many people went to the streets and demonstrated. So we see that advocacy does go a long way. And one person coming out there, for example, we start a hashtag on Facebook. We're in a social media era. Everybody uses Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. If we start a hashtag and say, okay, let's put forward refugee education. Let's try to get more refugees to be included in these spaces, or try to get governments to put up policies and laws that are inclusive. That could go a long way. So I feel like advocacy is going to make a huge difference. And secondly, a very few, organization. Okay, for example, we have UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, that puts in place funds or scholarships for refugee youth to access an education. So for example, we have the DAFI scholarship program, which runs in many countries, including South Africa and Malawi. And this is funded by the German embassy. So we have stuff like that, but it's not enough. How can we put in place solid strategies that allow refugees to access education? So for example, the DAFI scholarship only targets tertiary institutions, so students that are going to college or university. What about the young child in primary school or in high school? What happens to them? Is there a fund that's put in place to allow them to access education? So if we can also have donations, we can have funds put in place by, organizations that allow refugees to access an education, that would be a huge step, and that could go a very long way.
Definitely. Well, it's very admirable that you're working towards this issue. I think, a lot of times people don't necessarily bring as much awareness to the refugee population as they could. So, I definitely appreciate, all the work that you're doing. And the organizations that you just named, I would definitely charge anyone who's interested in addressing this particular issue to do some research on ways that they could help. Keith, did you have anything else?
No, I want to thank you, Khwima, for sharing your thoughts on this. As Taylor said, I certainly do agree that a lot of people overlook, the issues around refugee education. So thank you for bringing it to light and helping us understand ways that we can, advocate for it and put attention toward it. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Really, it's always an honor to, advocate for other people. It kind of shows that maybe, there is hope for a lot of people around the world. I saw you guys' I don't know if it's your motto, it's on your logo that says freedom comes hope, with freedom comes hope, or something like that.
Yeah.
With freedom comes hope. And I saw that, I was like, wow, maybe this is a sign, and today being International Youth Day, I just thought, maybe it will go a long way trying to advocate for policies and, get the word out there about refugee education.
Well, I'm glad that we were able to provide this space for you to do so. So definitely appreciate it.